Good evening. If you are a natural light photographer who is confused, overwhelmed, discombobulated when it comes to lighting and especially flash photography, then you're in the right place tonight. Tonight, I'm going to share with you the key to using flash photography, and I'm going to teach in a way that I don't think anyone else teaches. So, I don't know. Hit it, Seymour. Well, I think you've seen enough of that. Oh, what am I gonna do here? Too many buttons, too many things. Okay, I must have changed something. Oh well. Good evening, everyone. How you doing? I am Lee Love, and I am your host tonight, as always, every night, every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. here Eastern Time. And glad you could join us. Listen, I want to thank everyone that joins us every week, and also those of you who join during the week and watch the replays. It really means a lot to me. I appreciate it. Keeps me going. And so anyway, thanks very much. If you are would love to have you subscribe, be sure and go to youtube.photomentor.tv, or not .tv, photomentor.tv, and click the subscribe button. I really appreciate that. Hello, Ben. Good to see you. My buddy Ben Dowling there, Dowdy. Anyway, I hope that scanner's working okay for you. Just keep it as long as you need it, because it was just collecting dust here. So anyway, glad you could join us here tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about flash photography, and one of my favorite topics, of course. I love lighting. If you guys have watched anything that I've done in the past, I'm almost obsessed with it. All my work, I light everything I shoot, indoor, outdoor. And people say, well, why do you do that? And the reason is because it gives me complete control over my images. I can make them look lit, not look lit, whatever. The only downside is that it ruins me for watching television and movies, because I spend all my time studying the lighting instead of paying attention, unless it's a really great storyline, and then I have to admit I get sucked in. Okay, let's see what we got here. All right, so tonight again we're going to talk about lighting and some cool things like that. We're going to go into this is kind of part two. I did last week. I started this, which wasn't intended to be part two, but this is the beginning. Or not the beginning, I should say. This is a continuation of a long course that I'm developing for Photo Mentor Academy. And it's a multi-part course that goes into all kinds of stuff. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But if you are interested in learning more about what we're doing over there, go to photomentoracademy.com. Put your name and email address in there, and then I'll email you when we start rolling this out. So anyway, all right, I think that's it. Let's get started here. The first thing I want to tell you about or mention to you is a very famous quote that I use this quote a lot. If you've seen, I just love it. It just says it all to me. And that is that it was done by George Eastman, of course. And if you guys don't know George Eastman, then maybe you've been living in a cave, but George Eastman, of course, is the CEO and founder of Eastman Kodak. He says, light makes photography. Embrace light. Admire it. Love it. But above all, know light. Know it for all you are worth. And you will know the key to photography. And I couldn't agree more. Totally agree with that. It just, photography is all about lighting. There's no two ways about it. So anyway, okay, so let's kind of move on to the next thing here. We'll kind of get a little started here. So one of the questions I want to ask you is to get to kind of, when we talk about flash photography, I often use this as an analogy, and it will explain what I'm going to talk about here in a second. And that is, if I were to ask you what is the shutter speed required to capture lightning, what would you say? Do you think it would be, 1/8,000th of a second, 10,000th of a second? I don't know, half a second, bulb mode. I mean, just what do you think it would be? It's kind of a trick question, by the way, and I'm not asking you to answer it. I'm just wanted to kind of get you thinking about it. And the answer is there is no shutter necessarily fast enough to capture lighting. Now, there are some devices that will work on sound and things like that, but what I'm talking about is the fact that lightning is so quick that the only way to really capture it is to open the shutter, leave it open and in bulb mode, and then when the lightning goes off, close it. So it's a little bit of hit and miss. Now, there's some formulas and some things you can do, but again, to get a great image of lightning, it just takes a lot of practice. So the point I'm trying to make of all of this is that flash photography is very similar to the same scenario, in that you have to, there is no shutter speed for lightning. To capture flash, a lot of people think, oh, I have to use a fast shutter speed. Shutter speed has absolutely no effect whatsoever on flash photography. Now, I know this is hard to understand because it took a while for me to get it as well. But let me repeat that. In using flash photography, the shutter speed has no effect on the flash. Doesn't affect the power, doesn't affect anything about it. The only two things that affect flash photography, and I'm going to give you some examples here in a second, are the aperture and the ISO. That's it. So only thing that the shutter affects when using flash is the ambient light. So let's go back to the analogy again that of lightning, and that is you leave the shutter open, right? You don't really know what the shutter's going to be. I mean, what the shutter speed's going to be, and you sorry, let's close this out here. And so what happens is, to get it right, you just have to guess at what the shutter speed is going to do. You can do some bracketing, like in a situation like this scenario here, they've exposed for the buildings, but and then the lightning goes off and does the rest of the exposing. Now, so you're basically exposing for the background in a scenario like this, and then when the lightning triggers, then you're going to get that whatever the exposure of the lightning is. You just have no control over it. So anyway, it's the same kind of thing with flash, except that you have control of flash, of course, not the same thing that you do with lightning. So I'm gonna go into some detail about this. So I'm going to explain this to you. All right. So the first image I have here for you, example, is an image I set up. There's a woman here with a purse and just a sphere, and it was shot with the overhead light there. The light from the top is a 300 watt dimmed way down, and the light on the background is also just an incandescent light. So these are both incandescent lights. The focal length is about 85 millimeter, ISO 400, and f8. But the key is 1/60th of a second. So that's the exposure for the background. That's the first thing I did, is get the proper exposure for the ambient light. So the next thing you need to do is then I added the flash. Okay, I used a snoot, which is narrows the light down so it only lights the woman's face. Same scenario though, it's about 6 feet away. Everything else is exactly the same. ISO's the same, aperture's the same, shutter speed's the same. Even though it's what's called a mono light, like a studio light, it was dimmed way down because we were shooting at ISO 400, so you didn't need much light. But it's about 5 watt seconds. So anyway, as you can see, she's perfectly exposed. The lighting above and behind her is the same. Nothing changes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make one change, and the change is I'm going to only change the shutter speed. Okay, so all I did was go from 1/60th of a second to 1/25th of a second. In other words, one stop of light. All right, so if you notice, the background goes dimmer. The table top goes down, but the lighting on her is exactly the same. Nothing changes whatsoever. And that's because, as I said before, the shutter speed has no effect whatsoever on the flash, only the ambient light. So let's do one more. So we'll go down to 2/50th of a second. 1/250th of a second. Again, a whole nother stop of light. You could do in increments, of course, but didn't want to drag this out all night. So now I've gone another stop. In other words, one stop or twice the amount of light. I've cut twice the amount of light. So down to 1/250th of a second. Still f8, still 400th of ISO 400. The flash hasn't changed. The flash hasn't moved. Still in the same location. And we're still looking at a focal length of 85 millimeters. But if you notice, again, nothing changes. So there's 1/60th of a second, 1/25th of a second, 2/50th of a second. The exposure on the young lady is exactly the same. Nothing has changed whatsoever. So guess what? We'll go to the 500th of a second, and you guessed it, it gets darker. She is still exposed exactly the same amount of light. Nothing's changed because the flash does not care about the shutter speed. So let me kind of summarize this a little bit before I got a couple more slides, but before I do that, let me kind of just tell you about what I'm talking about here. So this is a very common scenario that I run into a lot, by the way. So if I go into if I'm doing a magazine shoot or whatever, it doesn't really matter, and there's a person in their home, or I want the background. This is one of the things I talk a lot about to people. The first thing I do when I go into a scenario, I'm looking for a shot, I'm looking for the background. Well, not necessarily true. I'm kind of looking for an angle, maybe to make it more interesting, but I'm also looking at the background. The background, why? Because the background is either going to tell the story or hurt the story, and I have to figure that out. Am I reinforcing the storyline? Because the background is just as important as anything else in the image, but yet it seems like a lot of new photographers miss that part. They either include too much background, or the background is irrelevant, or it's got things growing out of their head or whatever. They don't use the background, and it's very, very important that the background be a key player. So I like to say that you're responsible for every pixel in the frame. The background is part of that, so you want to use it wisely. Okay. So the first thing I do is I pick the background. Then I light the background or use the lighting that's there. Okay. And that's what this picture here would look like before. So this is what I would walk into in a scenario where I'm photographing a situation, a person in an office or something like that. And I have to decide, do I want to use the surroundings or in the background, or do I want to kill it? Now, it's not uncommon for me to go in to do a corporate shoot in like a conference. They'll say, oh, we set you up in this conference room, course, there's no room in there. They think there is, but there isn't. Anyway, and so the problem is there's overhead lighting, fluorescent lighting, and they sometimes can turn it off. Sometimes there's switches for it. Sometimes there's not. But it doesn't matter because by changing the shutter speed only, I can make that room completely dark, completely pitch black, and just add my own lighting. And I'll show that in a minute. But so I have to figure out, am I going to use the background and use the existing light, or am I going to get rid of it? So the same thing for you. If you're photographing outdoors, if you looked at the course, the part of the course I did a couple weeks ago on outdoor lighting, which I'm going to redo, by the way, with a little, it was overcast today, wasn't a very good example, but if I want to use the background, then I would probably underexpose the image, or expose for the background is what I would say. So I'd expose for the sky, maybe a nice puffy clouds, that kind of thing. And then I would add my flash, just like I'm doing here. In this scenario right here, I'd first expose for the background, for the existing light. And then you do that by changing. Now I could change the aperture and the ISO, which of course to get the right, if the shutter speed's too low. So for example, let's say the scenario is one where to get the proper exposure of the background, it's so dimly lit, I have to go to 30th of a second or 20th or 15th of a second. Well, that's too slow unless you're shooting on a tripod. Even then, it's still slow. So to get a shutter speed that's reasonable, I may have to crank up the ISO or lower the aperture, which is fine. The point is, I'm trying to use the shutter speed to grab the proper background exposure that I need. Okay, so then the next thing, as I said, I turn on the strobe and I power it up or power it down based on what I need. Now that I've got my locked in my exposure for the background, now I would just change the power of my strobe to be able to get the correct exposure on the subject. So again, 60th of a second, 1/25th of a second. As you can see, I'm reducing the amount of background, amount of ambient light. 2/50th of a second, same scenario. Much of this is now all disappeared. This would be a scenario where I would maybe again in a conference room. Here's 500th of a second. Okay, this is 1,000th of a second, and I think I might have, there's 2,000th of a second. So as you can see, once again, the exposure on the subject has not changed one bit. The exposure is exactly the same, f-stop's the same. I didn't need to change anything except one setting, and that is the shutter speed. Now, this might be one scenario where shooting on manual might make sense, but to do it, I would, again, I want to overdo this, but to go back, if I know this is going to be my exposure here, the first thing I would do was put it on maybe shutter priority, try 60th of a second, let the camera pick what the aperture and the shutter and the ISO needs to be. And then once I know I have a proper exposure on that background, I could go to manual. I could dial those settings in so they don't change. And then I can turn on my flash and I'm going to have a properly exposed image. The same thing is going to be true outdoors. So again, I know a lot of you don't do studio work or indoors things, but outdoor would be the exact same situation. Expose for the background, okay? First, let the camera tell you what the exposure of the background needs to be. Then put that into your system, your camera, and then turn on the flash, and then you're going to get a properly exposed picture. So, questions. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I hope so. All right. So now I need to explain something else to you about this before we go too much further. Now, to make this work, okay, so here's 1/25th of a second. Now, you need to look at your camera and figure out what the highest sync speed your camera will use. So I think, Tank, you and I were talking about some used lighting a couple days ago, a week or so ago. and they're great. I have some of the same lighting systems, but the problem is they're manual, meaning you can only shoot as fast as the shutter speed will allow you to shoot at. There's no what's referred to as high-speed sync. High-speed sync allows you to shoot past that speed. So in this scenario right here, if this 1/25th, most cameras, most Canons will go to 160th of a second. Then Nikons will go to roughly 200 or 250, depending on the model. And some of the others will go about the 250, most about the same. The highest I've seen is 320, but that's kind of rare. And you know what? I think I had a picture here. I don't think I loaded it for you guys. I want to show you this in a second. So, if you don't have this, okay, let me bring this in here real quick. Sorry. If you don't have a high-speed sync, as Tank and I were talking about on the scenario she was looking at, let's see, I think they are. Yeah, here. So if you don't have high-speed sync, what happens is your pictures will look like this. Okay. So the first one, okay, this is, if you note, now you can hardly see this right here, but if you look at the bottom of the frame, you see a black bar. Okay. Well, that black bar is because of the shutter opening and closing, and not opening and closing fast enough to be able to get out of the way. So what happens is what you're seeing is the shutter there, and so the flash catches that shutter when it goes off. This would be another one. This would be probably maybe 320th of a second. Okay, this is what it would look like. And this is what it would look like at maybe 500th of a second. So if you've ever been shooting with flash in manual, not manual camera mode, but I'm saying the flash is manual, or TTL will generally work. And you don't usually get this with an on-camera flash. It's when you move the camera off, the flash off camera, is when this is a problem, because what happens is there's no way to sync the two when they're that way. Now, there are flashes that will do that. That's what I'm talking about, though, is that's why you would go with the high-speed sync, is to be able to reduce this. So if you ever see this happen with your flash, it's because the shutter speed is too high. So if you lower the shutter speed to the natural or normal sync speed, which is usually, like I said, about 1/60th on a Canon, or 200 or 250 on a Nikon, then this will go away. All right. So now let me explain to you what this is and why it works this way. All right. So I'm going to show you guys a video here that I got from the what's the name of the guys? Slow motion guys. These guys are slow-mo guys. These guys are really cool. I encourage you to check out their website. I hope they don't mind I use this off of their YouTube channel. So what I'm going to show you first, I'll play it a couple times because it goes by pretty quick. This is a shutter, a video of a shutter at 500th of a second. Now, it was shot with what's called a Phantom video camera that shoots 10,000 frames a second, 10,000 FPS. That's pretty amazing. And it takes a lot of light, and I think it will only record for like 3 or 4 seconds at a time. There's so much data. Anyway, so I'm going to show you this, what it looks like, so you can see what I'm talking about, and then I'll explain it to you. All right, so what you're going to see is the shutter open and close. Okay, I'm going to do it again. I'll loop it. Okay. So so it kind of goes twice. All right. So what's happening there is that's what a shutter looks like on your camera. So it's opening. It doesn't just open and close. You see it really quickly, so you kind of can't tell what's going on here. But this is what it looks like at 500th of a second. So what has to happen At a slower shutter speed, when you're using 1/25th or something like that, it stays open longer. And that means that the flash has the ability to sync, that it's synced with this shutter opening. So when the shutter opens, the flash goes off. When it closes, the flash turns off. Okay. So now I'm going to show you one of, this is 1/1000th of a second. Okay, let's see here. I'll play this again. So this is 1/1000th of a second. Now you may notice, look how narrow that gap, that shutter opening is. Okay, so it's much, much smaller, obviously, and that's how they're able to, it's not really faster. The shutter speed is exactly the same physically, but what's happening is it's only open longer, the gap is smaller. So therefore, the shutter speed is effectively faster. But, so that's 1/1000th of a second. All right, and then of course, we'll do one more. And this one is 2/1000th of a second. You can see again how narrow that opening is. So what's happening here is when this is opening and closing, that flash has to go off exactly at the right timing when this shutter is open. So what happens here is this. High-speed sync, or HHS, okay, it will allow you to sync your flash over and above the limitations normally of the flash. So it's, again, go back, Canon's usually 1/60th of a second, Nikon's 200 or 250, depending on the model, and I think Sony's around 250 as well. So what happens is when you take that flash off camera to be able to use high-speed sync, they talk to each other using something called TTL, through the lens metering. I'm going to explain that in a minute. So what happens, you push the shutter, that the shutter opens or goes by, opens, and that flash will pulse a couple times really to get it right enough power, but it'll go off exactly at that point when that opening is in there. And that's how you're able to get high-speed sync, or in other words, shoot over the normal, let's say 200th of a second on your camera. So that is the scenario that I'm showing you here with this system here, is on 2/50th of a second. Again, it's not a problem if you're shooting at 60th of a second or even 1/25th. And on most, again, Nikon is 250, it would still work. But when you start going over that, then what's going to happen is you're going to get the black bar that I was showing you here before that looks like this. Okay, again, if you visualize that shutter going by that I showed you, that's exactly what's happening. As it opens up, the flash is going off, and so therefore the shutter is covering part of the image. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so that's high-speed sync. So if you're going to use an off-camera flash, you probably want to look for something. I recommend you look for something that has the ability to have TTL and high-speed sync. Now, let's talk about TTL for a second, and so I can tell you a little bit of how that works. So what TTL does, it's called through the lens metering, is really what it really stands for, I believe. I think that's what the L stands for, although it's not a metering. Probably logic or something. Anyway, it's through the lens, I can tell you that. It's probably an abbreviation for that. What happens is you don't see it, but the flash goes off really, really quickly and sends out a beam of light, and then the camera looks at that information and measures it, and then determines what the proper exposure is going to be. So if you take your camera, and I think Tank and I were talking about this the other night. asking last week. I think she was asking if your images look overexposed or they look too flashy, meaning all you see is flash, and the background's too dark, then the chances are that's probably because you're shooting at too fast of a shutter speed, or your ISO is not high enough, or in other words, there's not enough ambient light. So you're telling the camera, because a lot of people think, oh, I got to shoot at a high shutter speed, so they crank up the shutter speed to get a nice, steady, sharp image. In reality, what's happening, though, is you don't need to do that, because the flash is what's going to freeze the action, not the shutter, for the most part. Now, I mean, we can go into detail here about some of the differences. And I mean, when you're talking about dragging the shutter and doing some things like that to get kind of a special effect. But the point is that with TTL, you want to be able to tell the camera what's going on and how to adjust the flash. So let me give you a real world scenario. You are shooting your camera and you're going outdoors, indoor, doesn't really matter. And maybe you've got originally your camera set up at, maybe you're on aperture priority, and your camera's set up for, I don't know, f8. Okay, but now you change lenses, or you turn and you want to do a portrait of the person. And so there's a busy background, so you want to blur that background out. So maybe you go from f8 to 2.8. Well, when you do that, the TTL technology tells the flash, hey, I've got a lot more light coming in now. All right, probably 3 or 4 stops more light. So therefore, I don't need as much light. So what happens is now when you push that shutter, it sends out what's called a pre-flash. It measures that. And then the flash will automatically power down or not be as powerful. Now, maybe you've heard this before if you've tried this. So if you have your camera on and you push the button and you hear this, it just sounds like the flash is really working hard. It's just pow. But then if you make a change for some reason, it just doesn't sound, it just very quickly, it barely sounds like it's flashing. That's exactly what's happening. The camera, by making changes in the camera, ISO or shutter speed, or ISO or aperture, the camera's saying I need more light or less light, and so therefore it's turning the flash up from full power, 1:1 power, down to 1/64th power, or whatever the lowest it will go, based on what it needs. So if your images are too flashy, as I called it, or washed out, or look too much like flash, then you want to tell the camera to let more ambient light in, and therefore if you're using TTL, even like on camera flash or even a pop-up flash, and then the flash will now know, hey, I don't need as much light, and so it will power it. It'll give you just a little bit of light, enough depending on what your setting is, to be able to expose the image, or maybe put a little bit of sparkle in the person's eye, or just to fill in the shadows, but it's not going to be washed out and crazy looking. Okay. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's see here. I think that is any questions, comments, or snide remarks. Only from professional hecklers, though. No amateur hecklers. I think that's really what I want to. Let's see if I got any more here. Okay. So I've got that. We got the 2000. Okay. Yep. So again, we're back to Eastman, and this again. So that's really what I wanted to explain. I was going to go into color temperature, but be honest with you, I just ran out of time to pull that together. Well, maybe I'll cover that next week or in a next session. But color temperature, I'll just kind of touch on a little bit. Color temperature is based on it's developed by a guy named Kelvin, believe it or not, and that's why they measure the light in Kelvin, color temperature. But a lower number, like 2500 Kelvin, would be incandescent light bulbs, very warm looking light. A higher degree of Kelvin, like 6,000, would be a daylight. Now you're going, wait a minute, daylight should be warmer. It's not. It's actually cooler. Well, it's not cooler, but it is 6,000. So you're gonna, when you're looking for a strobe, you're gonna find them roughly between 5,600 and 6,000 degrees Kelvin. That means it is balanced for daylight, and it's gonna work perfectly outdoors, or indoors actually, if your camera is set for daylight balanced. So I prefer a daylight balanced light because I can always correct it if I need to. There's a filter you can put over the front of the light, and we did this. Actually, I don't think I showed this in the outdoor lighting show. I think that was part of the course that you had to take. Anyway, so there's a filter that you can put over the light called a CTO gel, color temperature orange. And what that does is that converts the daylight back to tungsten. So if you get a daylight light, you can use it for tungsten or 3,200 or 2,500 degrees Kelvin indoor lighting. Or if you take that off, you can use it for outdoor lighting. And if you've got light coming in from outdoors, outside, and you're doing real estate, that kind of thing, then you would want one that has outdoor lighting anyway, a 5,600 to 6,000 degree Kelvin temperature. Okay. Any questions? I don't see any other questions. I think that's it. Anything else, Sue Ann, that I missed? I don't think so. All right, thanks. So Sue Ann talks to in my ear here. So I'm not crazy. My parents had me tested. Okay. All right. Anyway, hopefully that's been helpful. And you guys understood what I was trying to say, that it's really all about the shutter speed and dealing with ambient light in when you're talking about flash, and so you don't have to don't have to worry about that, and that's how you would control the ambient light. So try it. That's all. Even if it's a speed light, even if it's an on-camera flash that you have pop-up flash, just use that. Just set it up on it's easier if you set it up on a tripod, and just set up, and just like with a lamp and something set up next to it, and then just try and just adjust the shutter speed going from the 60th of a second up to a higher shutter speed. What's your question, Sue Ann? When is Mike Peters going to get over on YouTube instead of quit asking us questions on LinkedIn? He does this every week. Okay. What's his question? All right, here, ask that question again, so he can hear you.
Okay, the question from Mr. Mike Peters is, so do I set my shutter to 1/250th to sync my flash to the camera and just use ISO and aperture to adjust the shot?
Okay, thanks. No. So you can shoot 250th of a second. Is going to be the highest that your Nikon's going to allow you to shoot without using high-speed sync. And if you notice, if you go into on the Nikon, there's a setting. It'll say 1/250th FP, and that FP means it's going to, if you go over 250th, it's going to go into high-speed sync mode. But what happens is, Mike, if you go to 250th, then you're going to pretty much kill any ambient light, and that's fine. But what if you want to include that? So let's say you're doing a birthday party or something indoors, and you don't want just flash, right? So if you go to 250th and just adjust your ISO and your shutter speed, or excuse me, ISO and aperture, what's going to happen is you're only going to get flash. It's going to kill any of the environmental light, any room light, anything like that. So what you want to do is use a slightly lower shutter speed so it picks up some of that light and gives you some mood lighting. gives you some lighting in the room. So let's say we're going to do something in your studio, for example, and you wanted to show the monitors, and you would not want, if you shot at 250th or higher, what's going to happen is it's going to kill all those lighting, and you're only going to get flash. So you kind of want to balance it. So the answer is it depends on how much ambient light do you want to be able to include. If you want to kill all the ambient light, like I said before, if I'm in a conference room and I'm doing headshots for corporations and I want to get rid of all fluorescent light, I don't want it to be able to taint or affect the color temperature of the portraits, then I want to use a higher shutter speed, 250th or higher, to kill all of that. But if I want to include that, so I'm trying to pick up some of that ambient light in the room, I want some mood lighting, I want to use a slightly lower shutter speed and then adjust my exposure. So it kind of depends on the scenario, but generally speaking, that's why I was saying, if I want to get some of the room ambience, what I want to do first is probably go to aperture priority or shutter priority, take a picture, let the camera tell me what the exposure looks like, and is it going to pick up that room or not, the lighting in the room and how much of it. Then I may go to manual from there and dial in those exact same settings, then adjust my shutter speed or aperture. Now what you could also do, Mike, is just go to shutter priority, dial in that shutter speed to lock that in, so it's going to pick up the room. Let's say it's 1/60th or 1/25th of a second, and let the camera pick whatever the aperture and ISO is going to be based on the rest of the light. And then that would also, if TTL with your Nikon, that's also going to raise or lower the power of the flash. So I don't know if that makes sense or not. Let me kind of if you don't mind, let me readdress it. Just first thing is, depends on whether you want the room light or not, which most of the time you want some of that ambient light. So I would take a shot on aperture priority or shutter priority, see what the image looks like, adjust the exposure based on how much of that room light I want to get. Okay. Then I would then go to shutter priority, lock that shutter in so that my ambient light doesn't change, and then go from there. Let the camera pick whatever the aperture and ISO is going to be. So hopefully that helps. And I can answer that again maybe when I see you next time. Hopefully that helps. Okay. All right. Anything else, Sue Ann? That was a pretty good question. Thanks very much for adding that. Anything else, Sue Ann?
Glad I caught it. Don't see anything on the board.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks, guys. I enjoyed it. Listen, I do want to tell you something. Sorry about that. I almost forgot. Next week, don't forget, next week is photo reviews, first Tuesday of the month. We do this every month. Submit your work. Just go to review.photomentor.tv, and you can submit that information.
9th next week.
Really? You know, you can make me check my calendar.
Sorry to screw up your calendar.
That's okay. My calendar is always screwed up anyway. I kept thinking 22nd. You're right. Wow, cool. Okay, nice. Never mind.
Skip that.
Forget that. Well, just fix it in post, I think they say is the way you get. So, all right, cool. Thanks. See, Sue Ann, what would I do without you? I'm lost here. I don't even know what day it is. So, all right. Hey, listen, guys. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Listen, I would appreciate if you would subscribe. And, hey, share this with somebody else, that may want some help. Thank you very much for subscribing. Thanks for joining. And hopefully this has been helpful. Let me know if you guys can always reach out anytime via Facebook or email. And so thanks very much.
One runaway intro.
Yeah, really. Not bad.
One mixed up date.
Oh well. I had some automation, I think, set up on that, and that's probably why. So that it was supposed to fade to me when it played. I probably messed it up somehow. I was testing it.
Well, everyone loves your intro, whether it was Runaway or not. And I think it must be a popular topic, this lighting.
Oh, it is.
Because you had been busting double digits on live today.
Yep. And Mike joined us. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.